So there are two ways to check conditions. The first is an if statement, and the other is a try-catch statement. So first I'll demonstrate the if statement. This is what the if statement looks like. If, and then a pair of round brackets, and then an opening brace and a closing brace. So let's say that I have an input, call it a string, and the value is going to be the word yes. Now let's say that what I want to do is check whether or not the input is equal to yes. So within the round brackets, I put in the condition, which is if input is equal to yes. And if it is equal to yes, what I'm going to do is print out a message to the terminal saying correct input. And I'm just going to comment this out. Now, let's see if it works. And I see correct input because the input is yes, and we are checking that the input is yes. Now take note of this here double equal sign. That means that we are checking if this is equal to this. Now what I could do instead is do this, and this would do the opposite, checking if the input is not yes. So basically, this means not. So now I'm going to run it, and I see no message. And that's happening because I am checking here if the input is not yes. That's the opposite of what I did earlier. Now, let's say that what I wanted to do was check if the input was yes, but also check if the input is no. So, one way is to change this back. Then what I'm going to do is add this bit here. This is an else if. Then all I have to do is specify the other condition that I want to check, which is when the input is not yes. And when the input is not yes, what I want to do is print a message to the terminal, and this message will be incorrect input. So, if I run this right now, what I should see in the terminal is correct input. The input is yes, and the first condition that's being checked is if the input is yes. So, I'm going to run this now, and I see correct input. Now if I change the input to no, what I should expect to see is this message. That's because the input is no, meaning that this condition will be false. So then what that means is that the program will then move on to this condition. Now I'm going to run this thing, and I see incorrect input, which is exactly what I expected. Now what I'm doing here is specifying the particular condition that should be checked should this condition be false. Now there is another way to check for multiple conditions in an if statement. I could just do this. What I'm doing is removing the if part of it and then just leaving the else. So what's happening here is that this part where the else is will check for all conditions, which is not this one. So basically, not one particular condition, but all other conditions. So now I'm going to run this thing, and I should see the incorrect input message. And I do, because no is not yes, and is therefore any other condition. I should also get the same result if input is a random string of characters. And I do. And if I change the input back to yes, then what I see is correct input. So that's how the if statement works. Now, there are more operators that you can use. So, I don't need the else part anymore, so I'm just going to remove that. And I'm gonna change the type of the input to an int, and also make its new value 5. What I could also do is take a number and then check if it is greater than something. For example, I could check if the input is greater than, say, 2. And if I run this, I should get correct input, because 5 is greater than 2. And I see correct input. I can check if the input is less than something. For example, if the input is less than 10, and I should see correct input, and I do. I could check if it's less than or equal to something. For example, less than or equal to 10, and I see correct input. And if I change the value of the input to 10, I also see correct input. And that's because the condition is less than or equal. I can also make the condition greater than or equal to 10, and if I run it, I should get correct input. And I do, because the condition is greater than or equal. Now, if I make the input 15, which is greater than 10, I should also get correct input. And I do. Now, what I can also do is check for more than one condition at the same time. For example, let's say that I want the input to be greater than 0 and less than 10. So in other words, between 1 and 9. So right now, if I should run this thing, I should not see correct input. So basically, no message. And I see no message. The input is 15, and 15 is greater than 10. So now, I'm going to change the value of the input to 0. And I see no message because one of the conditions is greater than 0, and 0 is not greater than 0. Now, if I change the input to 1, I should see correct input. And I do. 1 is greater than 0, and also less than 10. 9 is also greater than 0 and less than 10. So with that change, correct input. And if I change the input to 10, I should see no message. And no message. Because 10 is equal to 10, and one of the conditions is that the input is less than 10. Now, what I could also do is this. I could check if the input is greater or equal to 0, or if the input is equal to -5. So now, let's run this thing and see what happens. I'm gonna keep the input at 10, and I should see correct input, because 10 is greater or equal to 0. And I see correct input. What I'm gonna do now is set the input to -4. I'm gonna run it now, and I should see no message. And no message, because -4 is less than 0, and is also not equal to -5. If I set the input to -5, I see correct input, because -5 is equal to, well, -5. So, what's happening here is that the if statement runs this code when this condition or this condition is true. So basically, when using an or, only one of these specified conditions has to be true. Now, what if what you want to do is check for errors? To do that, you can use a try-catch statement. This is what a basic try-catch statement looks like. You start off with a try and then a pair of opening and closing braces. Then you add catch and then a pair of opening and closing braces as well. finally, you add this part to actually catch the exceptions. Now, this is what a basic try-catch statement looks like. So, the code that you want to attempt to execute goes here. And here, in the catch section, is where you put the code that you want to run when this code here fails to execute, where such an error would result in the program crashing. So, to demonstrate how the try-catch statement works, this is what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to get the user input. I'm going to save the user input to a string. And as you can see from the message here, what I want is for the user to enter in a number. Before I move on, I'm just going to test this real quick. It probably works. Please enter a number, and I'm going to type in 45, and that works. So, next I will convert this here string into an int. So, how do I convert a string to an int? I'm just going to look it up. I know it's possible, I just don't remember how to do it at this particular moment. So, I'm just going to look up C++ convert string to int. And this looks like it might be useful. And this example here is exactly what I'm looking for. So, this is what I want to attempt to do. Convert this string here into an int. Now, what I want to show you is that this sometimes does not work. And when it doesn't work, it results in an error which crashes the program. First, I'll do the conversion outside the try-catch block. So, I'm going to make a new variable, and I'm going to call it converted string. And the value of this variable will be the user input string converted into an int using the function which I just found. So basically, what should happen when I run this, assuming that the conversion runs successfully, is that a message will be printed to the terminal saying that the conversion was successful. So, I'm going to run this thing and see what happens. So, enter a number, say 34, and conversion successful. I'm going to enter in 762, and that also works. I'm going to run this again, and the value which I've just input is not a number. And the program crashed, as you can see here by this error message. Now, if I were to say put this bit inside of the try section of the try-catch statement, and then, should the stuff in the try section fail to execute, print out an error saying that the conversion failed, what's going to happen when I input something which is not a number? Error. Conversion failed. But the program did not crash. And if I enter in a valid number, like 446, conversion successful. So, what's happening here is that first, this code here tries to execute. And if it's successful and there are no errors, then great, no problem. If there are any errors, then the code here runs. In this case, what I'm doing is just printing out an error message. Now, the way I have it now, this will catch all errors. These 3 dots means all errors. Now, what if I wanted to catch a particular error? In that case, what I could do is this. I would just find a resource on how to do that, and then read through it, and then find an example. For the purposes of this demonstration, all I wanted to do was just stop the program from crashing when an error happened, so checking for all errors works just fine. Now, let's get back to the password generation program. When checking whether the input is yes or no, we don't have to check for errors. This is because saving an input to a string doesn't really create any errors. So for this, we just have to check if the input is yes or no. So for this, an if statement will work nicely. Now, what is the condition? If the user input is equal to yes, then generate the password. Else if, and before I continue, I will say that here I could just use a separate if statement, but I'm not going to. Anyways, if the user input is equal to no, then exit the program. So, let's see if this works. Now, just to make sure that the if statement is catching the condition correctly, I'm just going to print a message to the terminal saying that a password will now be generated if the input is yes. And if the input is no, then the message will be that the program will exit. Now I'm going to run the program. So, generate a random password. Yes, I do. And a password will now be generated. Excellent. And this time, I'm going to enter in no. And the program will exit. Excellent. Now, what if I entered something that was not yes or no, like a random string? Well, that's a problem. There's nothing telling the user that they typed in something wrong. I did not account for that possibility. So really, what I have to do is account for 3 possibilities. 1, that the user types in yes. 2, that the user types in no. And 3, that the user types in something else. So, to account for any other inputs, I'm just going to add an else. I'm checking for yes. I'm checking for no. So then, to check for all other inputs, I don't really need to check for any specific condition, just everything else. So, for any other input, I'm going to print out a message, and that message will be, please enter yes or no. So, let's see if it works. I'm going to enter a random string, and please enter yes or no. And now I'm going to enter yes, and that works. And now I'm going to enter no, and that works. Now that I've checked whether the user wants to generate a password, I need to actually generate the password. So, to generate the password, first I have to know how long the password has to be. What I'm going to do is this. I'm going to create an int variable, call it password length, and this will hold the length of the password, as in how many characters the password has to be. Now, recall that here, we saw that the user can enter in pretty much anything, except what they enter in might not be a valid integer. One way to get around that, and also check if the user has entered in a valid integer, is to save the user input as a string. Then try to convert that string to an int. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to print to the terminal a prompt, and that prompt will be, please enter a password length. And then I'm going to get the user input, but before I can do that, I have to create a variable to hold the user input, and I'm going to call it user input password length. Now that I have a variable to hold the user input, I have to get the user input into that variable. And finally, I have to convert that string into an int. But first, I need a try-catch block. That operation may result in errors which might crash the program. So, I want to try to convert the string to an int. Then I want to catch all exceptions, since all I want is for the program to not crash if the conversion fails. Now that I have my try catch statement, what I'm first going to do is create a variable to hold the converted string. Call it converted string. And then I'm going to assign to converted string, or at least try to, the value of the converted string. And I did that over here, so I'm just going to copy this. And I want to convert this. Alright, so that's done. And now I'm going to preset the value of converted string to 0. And then, if there's an error, I will print out an error message, and that message will be, "You have not entered a valid number." So, let's see if it works. I do want to generate a password, so yes. Now, let's try a valid number, like 56. I should see no output because I don't have an output, and that works. Let's run this again. This time, I'm going to enter in something which is not a number, and error. You have not entered in a valid number, so that works. Now, just to make sure that the input is converting correctly, I am going to print out the value of the converted input. So, I'm going to run this thing. Let's try 67. Alright, I typed in 67, and the password length is 67, so that worked.